Just for everybody's benefit, the question is, when people read Royce, they seem to understand what he says and either agree or disagree. Since the publication of James's Pragmatism, however, the argument has been over what the text means, and the issue is why is that so difficult, and what do we make of this difference?
Okay. This is my friend Stan here. So, let's take the first one first. When people say they understand Royce, I think that's perhaps precipitous. What happened is, don't worry, I'm not going to lay out on your question. After the James book was published in '67, Morris Phillipson, the director of the University Press, who had shepherded it at Random House Canal, I went to the University of Chicago. So he called me and he said, I want you to do something for me. He said, we have decided to do these 4 volumes. John Smith's The Problem of Christianity and Condemning the Letters and so on. He said, I want you to do the 2 volumes of the writings and so on. So I have to tell you, at that time, I was a card-carrying Jamesian. I mean, I was just imbued with the whole thing. I thought it was a knockout. And so, I mean, I said, all right. So I got myself up here. The first time I came, I was in an attic room in Brattle Street. Well, this time, I got into the old Boston Statler there and came over to Widener. Frank had done some work and so on, but basically we were talking a mess in the papers. And, man, it was hot. And there was a Tennessee Williams fan. Mary Maywald was up there doing some stuff, so on. And I kept reading this thing. Remember what I said to you earlier about the fact that I don't know what they're up to, or I don't know what up to, so it's not, a form of, like, crippling agnosticism. What it does is it keeps me from having a conceptual schema that I lay on. I have to say, there's a confession, Stan. I had a conceptual schema that I was laying on, right, these Royce papers, and it was called William James. See? And I wasn't getting anywhere. You understand? I could not read Royce through this lens. Right? Asking the wrong questions and so on. So this is the year that Kennedy was shot. As a matter of fact, Kennedy was shot the weeks that I was up here. And I know that, I said, if I don't get, because I knew that if I couldn't get on the inside, then I couldn't do this. It was just too much work. Enormous amount of work. And so if I didn't have any affection, so in Royce's sense, any kind of loyalty, it wasn't going to go, or it would turn out to be cardboard. So I said, I got to find this out. What's going on? And then there was a kind of a sartori for me. He said, this guy starts out, he starts out radically proletarian, man, in that mining camp. And getting his ass beat up in that school in San Francisco on the ship and so on. And that he always sort of had his hat in his hand. Right? Never comfortable here in Cambridge. Never. And he seemed to be worried about other kinds of things, like that history of California is superb. And his sense of the, social redemption and so on. And so, I saw it sort of like in parallel, and then I realized that was a mistake. As Watson said to Crick, after stealing Rosalind Franklin's radiographs, it's a double helix. Royce is a double helix. It doesn't go like this. It goes like this. Once I got that, you see, then the whole thing just spoke differently to me. So I think that I'm not saying Royce is more complex. God knows he's complex. What I'm saying is that there's a kind of a tissue there, tissue is, did you ever do any anatomy and study the hands and so on? I've done that. It's quite incredible what's in here. Trace these nerves. That's the way we Royce. So now, the pragmatism, I think, matter of fact, I just did a tutorial for a colleague. on the pragmatism, line by line. And I was astonished anew by how incredibly telescoped that book is, one. Apologies to say, remember McDermott, it reads easy, but it's hard. Two, how James threw us off the trail by saying radical empiricism has nothing to do with this. This is simply false. Radical empiricism is the DNA of that book. Now, you know he gave the lectures up here, and he's been doing things. Wilshire contends it goes as far back as the essay on Spencer and Quale. Certainly the key to it is in the 1884 on some emissions of introspective psychology, where he does this business about relations as affective, and there are no gaps, continuous transitions, or all that stuff. I mean, otherwise the Russell Savage critique and Moore Savage critique of pragmatism holds. But James isn't setting it up that way. Now, just a codicil here. You know, he stayed at the Harvard Club. I told you about the subway opening. And he was wined and dined. He'd get off the train. I'd whip up to 116th Street. Lots of loving cups and lots of stuff. I mean, he was like, man of the hour. James ate that up. Royce would be very uncomfortable with that. Royce was systemically insecure about that kind of stuff. But James was always playing to the gallery. You saw that in the conference, in the Italian Roman conference on the psychology thing. That's another revealing story about James. And so he works it through, and then he gives it to Longman's Green. He did not go over it again. He just gave it to Longman's Green. And he once said, I've got to give up this squashy popular lecture style and do something more stringwissenschaftlich. And he tried some problems, and of course it became torso, and he never finished it, and so on. An enormous percentage of James's published works are squashy popular lectures. Of course, anybody who worked in the stuff in Houghton knew that there were these salt and pepper books. This saw you off the ground, Miller Bode and all the stuff. I mean, on Mill's logic, Kant, right? And we finally published that stuff at the last two volumes of the works. But okay, so now directly to the question. See, I think that people who read the pragmatism have an idea. They have a whole kit bag of philosophical nostrums, definitions, assumptions, versions of traditions, and so on. And James is always upsetting that apple cart. And it becomes very irritating. And too quick, the assumption is he really doesn't know what he's doing. But the fact of the matter is, what he is doing, and even though he can be a little bit, shall we say, quick on historical judgments and so on, what he is doing, he's trying to say that, this is the way it goes philosophically. That is how you just live your life. This is how it goes philosophically. That's really what he's trying to say. And you see that in the chapter on common sense. So the other thing, Stan, there is that, interestingly enough, there's a resistance to philosophical wisdom that is presented in a way that makes immediate sense. There's a resistance to that. Because somehow or another it's like in the university where if your students like you, you're not really serious. Right? That craziness. That if you're able to communicate, apparently you've got nothing important to say. That obfuscation is an essential dimension of seriousness. So that is not to say that philosophically there aren't troubles in the pragmatism. I mean, because there are, right? But now what is really unfortunate is that he then took on to respond to all this. He was shocked when it all happened. And in volume 11 of the Correspondence, there are over 200 pages in which he responds to all his critics. And then he publishes The Meaning of Truth in 2009. It ate up an enormous amount of his last 2 years, unfortunately. And And if I had been around there and been his rabbi, I would have said to him, why don't you let it sit? There's other things to do. But he didn't, you see. And one reason is because he knew what Russell was going to hit him with when he died. Really great psychologist, but not much of a philosopher. And James knew that was coming. And it really scorched his ass. I mean, he was really upset about it. And the reason for that is, I'm sorry to say, pride. Someone else? Yeah.
You are known as having claimed that radical empiricism was actually the core of James's metaphysics, and yet Richard Rorty says it's of no consequence. Can you make a comment about that?
Yeah. I know this about Rorty very well. 3 times at least in my presence, one of them going back 35, 40 years, Rorty has said that the 3 worst books in the history of American philosophy are James's Radical Empiricism, Dewey's Experience in Nature, and Whitehead's Process in Reality. And I just talked to Brandon about that very thing. I asked Brandon if he had the same kind of position, which he does not. Quite the reverse, as a matter of fact, on that. Rorty had a deep antipathy to what we would call metaphysics in the grand style. I don't really think you could call radical empiricism metaphysics in the grand style. I certainly wouldn't call experience in nature metaphysics in the grand style if you're thinking about the Critique of Pure Reason or the Phenomenology of Hegel. But if you're thinking about Aristotle's metaphysics, yes, because experience in nature is Aristotle's metaphysics in another garb. So you also know, that Rorty has deep dubiety about seriousness of this kind of endeavor that I'm doing here. And that though he makes this radical break with the analytic tradition, the linguistic turn, which is one of the earliest and still one of the best readers in analytic philosophy, was published in the same year as the writings of William James. And in the preface, introduction to the linguistic turn, Rorty says the task of philosophy is not experience but logic. And in the beginning of the writings of William James, it's the reverse. Then Rorty does the philosophy of the mirror of nature and so on, which book was to me, of course, but caused a lot of trouble in the establishment. But he still, even though he becomes sort of radical about this whole about conversation, contingency, irony, all the stuff which I think is really very interesting, important, when talking about these matters, he's still very traditional, that is, establishment analytic traditional. So all I can say to you, sir, is that with all respect and admiration for my colleague Rorty, I don't agree with that. Who, Rorty? Oh, see, he was able to do what the rest of us weren't able to do because we didn't have purchase. See, he has purchase. That's part of the establishment. We were on the margins. That's why it's so nifty. Where did Lambeth go? I was just going to say something nice to him. John Locke. Were you getting uncomfortable? Was I making you uncomfortable? Go ahead. Right.
Now, what is there that's alive in Royce? Is it a bit of theology that's left over? Is it the stuff about evil? I don't like to talk about evil anymore. Is it perhaps the loyalty? What for you is alive?
Okay, so now with regard to the first, one of the reasons why students like James, right, I'm sure the way you, master teacher Locke, do it and so on, is that James is very iconoclastic. And Royce is not iconoclastic. And in many ways, I mean, I use the term throwback. I mean, Royce is a real old-fashioned guy, and in many ways, he's a grind, you see. And I'm drawn to Royce because just let me lay this right direct to you, pal. Royce cared about what was going on in a way that James didn't give a shit about anything. I mean, for all the stuff about James being involved, come on. I mean, the uncertain blindness and so on. He's shocked that people are living like that in the North Carolina. What is he? Come on, how could he be shocked in the middle of the 19th century? Come on. You say, life is worth living is a dreadful little essay. Huh? The whole thing is Novo Brahmin. He trashed his Irish forebears, He was deeply anti-Irish, embarrassed by them, embarrassed by his sister, you see, because she was liberal. So Royce, on the other hand, is a guy that, I mean, his sense of social responsibility is, to me, very, very, very meaningful, and he really, there's this letter that Hildening prints in the letters and the biography and so on. Writes a date, and Royce says, "I'm just an old fogey carrying a lot of books. People make fun of me. I'm worthless. I'm burned out," and so on. And James never talked like that. So I say to my students, okay, I mean, this is difficult. So what's up here? What's up here is, if we think very deeply and difficultly about the whole question of being, knowing, and the deepest trenches of religious sensibility and so on. I mean, can we still pay attention to the diurnal? I mean, can we still be interested in community in these concrete ways? So. But I understand what you're saying. Loyalty is very difficult to teach. I wrote the Introduction to Loyalty. I read it 3 times through. I mean, having a lot of trouble with it. Okay? He's not user-friendly. But on the other hand, you see, Royce is writing about where I think I am in my life and where I think we are in our lives, you see. And so that I'm really here, if I may say so, duty-bound to do something with it. I mean, who else is writing like this in philosophy? Right. So, okay, someone else? Faust.
I'm wondering if you could say more about James's aversion to promises.
Promises?
Yes.
Well, I mean, see, if you take the tychistic as ontologically stranding, right? You're always on edge about promises. You see, and if you believe that the whole business is unfinished, you see, the pluralistic universe is really, in a sense, just a modest vestibule to what I think he's really up to, which we now really understand in a different way. Understand here is ironic. I mean, you saw that piece in the New York Times a month or so ago with a dreadful title, Out There. There is no out, there's no in, there's no up, there's no down. The stuff about dark energy at dark, I mean, I don't know if you read that. You ought to read the middle of that. I mean, forget it. I mean, forget it. You see. I mean, all the stuff we're doing is just like a backyard, local stuff. Anything. And, James had a sense for that, you see. What would be a promise? I mean, what can I ask for? So as a little boy growing up as an Orthodox Roman Catholic, I said, well, what are you going to pray for? You see. So Kant says in the 4 great questions, right? I mean, what can I, what can I know? What can I do? What can I hope? You see. So of the 3 virtues, to me, it's hope is the virtue. But this hope is not the same as a promise. because I read hope as, going back now to the business, I'd say for Royce, it's not good enough just to hope. You got to work, you say, right? So you got to work. And so then this line that the medical students always make fun of me, mock me, that the nectar is in a journey and only there. It's nowhere else. For me, I'm not talking about you, Faust, you work it out. But for me, the nectar is in a journey and nowhere else, you say. And so you say to me, say, Faust, I say, McDermott, what are you up to? Well, what I'm up to is I'm standing here in a little hall. The dean is here, and so on. That's all I'm up to. That's it. That's the whole meaning of my life at this point. And all this other stuff, right? All my children, all the stuff is here. This is right. This is it. You see. And so coming in here, I hope that it would go well. Who knows? Okay. Huh? But now, it doesn't mean that, I said that James, towards the end, you see, the hope becomes a matricial virtue. But a promise is different. And here's the problem with a promise. A broken promise can destroy you. You see? And if you have heightened expectations, or if you have inherited expectations, you are looking at trouble. And if you dump on your children expectations that they can't possibly match, and which are not really germane to their inner life and so on, you put them into trouble. Expectations have to arrive from the way in which I have my experiences. Right? They have to come. And that's what radical empiricism is really about. That, in other words, the stuff flows out, breaks open, comes back, turns around, and so on. It doesn't come down. It's not given. Right? That way. So, now, the business, suppose you talk about the word promise and you use the word belief. This big-time misunderstood thing called the will to believe, which he then later said, I should have called it the risk of belief. Okay? Now, what does the will to believe mean? What the will to believe means is that, you see, if I live my life concavically, that everything is always repetitive, right? It's all, just sort of repetition and so on, then, I just keep turning in and into myself. I become more and more hysterical. I become an ideologue. I become dangerous. I become a detached individual. If I live my life convexically, I can get, right? I can get into trouble. Right? But there's something beyond my present sight. It may not be good, but it's always reach. Now, I think, you see, the ultimate sadness is our glory. That we are radically, totally, ineluctably, whatever, transient, passing through. Okay. I'm at the age where all my friends now are dying. When I was about 28, 7 or 8, one night, 3 a.m., reading through this stuff, children, a bit of stuff going on, so I reading these guys. I sat back and I said, Jesus, all these people I'm studying are dead. They're all dead. And then there was a voice that came to me and said, and you're next. Now, at 28, of course, you say, hey, wait a minute, right? But at 75, you don't want to hear that voice, okay? But the fact of the matter is, you see, the fact of the matter is that it's. See, I didn't say we are transient like, the guy that sleeps in the tiger cage outside Union Station in Chicago. I say we are. It's transiency. We're passing through. So the question is, what's the way? See, I say that James provides us with what I take to be really. Right? A reading of experience that I take to be so, and it's Dewey in honest experience and in experience of nature, right? That articulates this structurally. So there are texts in the first 3 chapters of our experience, like the one about you have to be separated and then regathered, right, organically, you see, before you can grow. And if you stay out too long, you die. And if you don't get cut off, you see, right, you just fester and it's bullshit and nothing happens. That stuff is powerful out there. So that the whole business of being in the world is an aesthetic. Right? That's what it is. And so then, once you do that, then you begin to see, and Dewey has this wonderful thing, and I grew up this way, that, the craftsmen, people doing things, and make things, and so on. High art is great, but it's also getting away. Right? So, don't ask for too much, Faust, you may get it. So I have a thing I've been working on for a long time. It's called, Could You Help Me? Can you help me? You promised to help me. What's the worst thing you can say about somebody? What could the worst thing be said about me? You can't count on McDermott. If I ever heard that somebody said, you can't count on McDermott, I'd get out of here. Doesn't mean that I'd be able to do anything, much, you understand? Well, what does it mean to be counted on? You mean to be able to help. Right? Not to solve. Right? Not to solve, not to cure. Right? To heal en passant, and so on. So the promises are treacherous. And you promised, Dad. I know, but things changed. I lost my job. But you promised. Right. Well, things happen. Okay. Things happen. But then it's the other side of the surprises. Hey, I got to tell you something. What? I got another job. Let's go back to that promise. See the rhythm? So I said he's skeptical. I didn't say he doesn't. And I'm skeptical. Yeah, 2. Okay. Is he allowed 2 questions? Right? Okay.
As you all know, James wrote a eulogy, and I'm wondering, I suspect, I read both Emerson and Royce, James, that Emerson seemed to haunt both Royce and James.
Seem to haunt? Huh?
Seemed to be a guru to them.
Yeah.
Prophetic figure.
Right.
They are somehow working out in a more articulate way. And I'd like to comment on this relationship
Right.
between Emerson and both Royce and James.
Okay. So, I don't think James liked Emerson much. You can check this out. I put this together. Matter of fact, Broderick, there's a new book on Emerson coming out. You can see the young man, and this piece of mine is in there. What does James, Royce, Dewey, Santayana, and Peirce think about Emerson? That's this thing, okay? So I'll just do the 2 of them. At the centenary, 1903, James was asked to give the address and so on. And he talks about reading all of Emerson and so on. Now, there's no time here, and Richardson, who is the master of Emerson and James, is in the audience, so we got to be careful here. I think, Emerson was supposed to have visited James when he was like a week old also. I mean, I think that stuff gets real old after a while, you know what I mean? You grow up with that. So. But I also think that, this is really ironic, you see, just as, people would think of James as being squashy, I think James thought Emerson was sort of squashy. And, calendar guy, right, so on. And he writes this piece, it's okay. But the piece on Emerson, of all of them, which is really, it's Dewey. Dewey understands Emerson. And it's Dewey who closes the piece on Emerson. And in the end, as it always is, he says, it's character, which James never got in his stuff on Emerson. So, see, the thing is that of the 7 of them, right? Peirce, James, Royce, Dewey, Santayana, Meade, and Whitehead, right? That's the 7. Emerson is the 8th. So that's all right. Only Dewey had no association with Harvard. You realize that? Dewey is the only one that did not have an association with Harvard. And when Dewey gave the lectures on Honor's experience, the first William James lectures, you go to the back matter, and you see how Dewey he's touched, he's very tender to making a fuss over and so on. So kind of insecurity. He's the only one outside of this whole Harvard thing. Right? And that is why I think he's the only one that really gets Emerson. Okay? Because, it's the old business of Freud's. I mean, you got to eat your father. All right? So, anyway, what's the other question?
Well, very quickly, you mentioned that the being in the world is very aesthetic. And I'm reminded, and I like to...
Not seeing the world. I didn't say seeing the world. Being in the world, not seeing the world. I mean, wow. Look, it's hands, okay? Not the eyes, it's hands. This is not Descartes, man. This is Aristotle and Dewey. Okay? All right. Right.
Right. Though he wrote no book on aesthetics, I think a claim has been made that James's philosophy is aesthetic through and through.
Right.
Your comments sort of
Right.
so I can comment on that.
Well, I think radical empiricism is the metaphysics for abstract expressionism and revolution of sculpture, dance. Niels Bohr. I mean, look at the people who picked up from James. Richardson says in the Maelstrom of Modernism, and the word modernism here in Richardson's vocabulary and in mine is a high-powered, good word, right? We're not postmodern guys, you see. So, when Kandinsky saw Monet's haystacks at the Tetrakoff in Moscow, this is in Kandinsky's spiritual law. He says, "What the hell is this? Who is this? What is he doing?" Because Kandinsky to that point had been doing troikas and Russian soldiers in the snow, that kind of stuff. He said, "What is this?" He said, "I looked down at he said, haystacks. There are no haystacks. What is this?" And then Kandinsky says, "I got it. The object is no longer indispensable. There are no more objects." Right? I mean, he broke into this whole drama of impressionism, and so on. And that's actually what I think goes on in radical empiricism on some omissions with respect to psychology and in James. I mean, it is an absolutely number one revolution in consciousness. That stuff, not the pragmatism. Right? And Dewey, you see, understood that, and in his piece in Civilization, Development of American Pragmatism, he said, "I read the principle." He said, two things happen. One, he says that objects don't sit next to each other like this. He said they're all concatenated and webbed all over the place, and relations are affectively undergone, right? And he said, and two, organisms are interest-bearing, naturally. You see? Right? Dewey sees that. Makes the whole turn, 1890. You can see Dewey make the turn. And then in Studies of Logical Theory, 1903, it's all there. All right? So, now Royce's turn is different, Brad. It's a different turn. It's also a very big turn, but it's not that turn. You notice I pointed out that word consequences. It's the turn of upshot. It's the meaning of upshot, you see. So, we more? Yeah. Cornell West. Thank you.
As someone coming on as a graduate student in Princeton and doing master's degree in analytical philosophy and learning much from my professors, but still stealing away to read James Dewey, McDermott, John Smith, and the others. To be here now in 2007 and to have this kind of public acknowledgement of the genius of James Royce means much. And to meet him the way that you did,
Right.
the way that you have, I just want to thank you. I want to say this, though, that in defense of Royce, I don't know of a more lively and vivacious history of modern philosophy than this.
Right.
I've taught that text in prison, especially the last chapter.
Right.
On pessimism, optimism, and moral order.
Yeah.
And it comes alive in the way in which James is delivering the lecture. But that's a different Royce. That's not a different lecture. And that's not other, but there's moments in Royce, Brown and people on and on. Our dear friend is so short better than anybody else. And that's the 86 fascinating with constant pressure, the biology of humility. That there's no one that comes close to that kind of language. But the difference is this. It's almost the difference between Mendelssohn and Brahms and Mozart and Beethoven. That here, Royce is a young man. He's 36 years old. He gives the lecture at 34. He's dead at 60. It's like Mendelssohn and Mozart. This is philosophy at an incredible level. But he feels like an old man. Because he's carrying so much weight.
Right.
That ontological sadness that you talked about, that's probably already set in Grass Valley, so that he's carrying the
Right.
weight. Whereas William James, the Emersonian, is the last day.
Right.
Eternally young. I'm not talking about Peter Pan because he's got a tragic sensibility. But he's eternally young. There's a buoyancy there. Because I think the difference is Emerson in any way that eternal buoyancy is Schopenhauer who haunts Josiah Royce.
Right.
To the very end. We don't know an American philosopher who have been so haunted by the depth of the darkness of Arthur Schopenhauer.
Right.
Accidentally Schopenhauer, you see 36 pages in that history. They're going to get 37. God gets less. This is a very idiosyncratic history. And Schopenhauer hunts him all the way down. So does Browning. But Browning is not even at the deeper level of Schopenhauer. And when you invoke an ontological sadness, I can see the continuity. I think of your wonderful essay on death, 1986. The inevitability.
Right. Right.
21 years old. Still fresh. Just read last week. Speaks very deeply. There's a connection between this sense of darkness and bleak, wrestling with dark mysteries and not in any way opting for some kind of Emersonian optimal movement. Now, I do think James is actually quite profound on this, and with you and I would disagree. I think he has some darkness that is very real, just that he's able to hold us almost like birds, Saul's young brother. He doesn't want to go there. He's been there before. He's got to stay away.
Right.
And so James is able to remain, sustain a level of buoyancy. But I think this issue of the language of Royce, I want to defend in certain instances. And similarly, so in terms of you really can't talk about the 21st century unless you go through some darkness like Schopenhauer. And Royce went through and stayed for a long time. A long time. By the time he came out, the suffering God, the Christian affliction, that we haven't got into it yet, but we have to sooner or later confront, that allows him to preserve his sanity and his buoyancy. Does that make sense, my brother?
Yeah. Generally, I think the divine appropriation of our suffering at the end is really very deep and moving in Royce. It is, of course, not salvific, right? It's only healing. Yeah. Well, right. Yeah. I don't think we have time here to go into the James thing. I used to think like you did about James, but after finishing the 12 volumes of the Correspondence, I'm not so sure about that. But yeah, no. Well, Richard, he's the master, but I don't agree with him either. But hey, West, I mean, just because the two of you, I'm not gonna, cave in, right? I mean, but what you said something here, which is, I think, look, we could talk about the other stuff. I want to go back to something you said about, being young at Princeton and so on. You really don't have to sneak off and do it. My friend Darby, had to do some of that as late as, 10 years ago and so on, about sneaking off to do this stuff. But, most places here, you still have to sneak off, that. And that, that Cornell West, that is such a serious problem for us that it seems as though, when Emerson says, what the hell's wrong with us? Why can't we have a kind of, sense of the originating quality of our own experiences? And it always gets interpreted as jingoism. Rorty, for example, absolutely mocks this business of it being American philosophy. You know that. He thinks that just doesn't carry at all. Herbert Schneider's famous history of American philosophy, the first one that was ever done, just dismisses all this kind of way of thinking about it that you and I have been doing, you see. And so I don't think it has anything to do with jingoism, territorially imperative, any of that stuff. I think what it has to do, you see, I think, Royce, there's two kinds of provincialism. There's a kind of crap that goes on that we don't know what other people think or do, we don't care, we're prejudiced, all that shit, God. But there's another kind of provincialism which has to do with the sacred character of that from whence I come. For my neighborhood in Richmond Hill in New York City. From Queensbridge, where he comes from. From where I tell my students, I had two guys from Junction, Texas this semester, two guys, I mean, God forbid, what a place, Scorpions, rattlesnakes, they're out there bailing hay and shit. They're going to go on to be doctors, And they lit up when I, the big shot New York City kind of guy, right, reached out for them and had them tell me stories and so on, you see. Royce is really good on this sacred character provincialism, the sacred character of, the single experience, the local experience, and so on and so on. But you see, we carry around with us this peculiar kind of being marginalized because we're interested in something that's homegrown. Now, the more you get to know American philosophy, of course, that is totally, entwined with the whole of the Euro-American world. And so our man Royce starts out with Schopenhauer, and I agree with you that he never really got Schopenhauer out of his blood. And do you know that there are some secret Schopenhauer guys around, but that it is not possible to do serious work at Schopenhauer graduate programs in this nation? Now I know because I tried to get a guy in. Yeah. So anyway, now Wes, one more thing, and Richardson, and so on. You see, this kind of conversation is to me is what I mean by what are they up to? Because this isn't going to end in a disagreement. This is going to end in heightened awareness and sensibility, right? See, it's not going to end in like who's right and who's wrong. It's going to end in some kind of deepening of the whole thing. So when I go back, you see, to read, what I'm going to do when I go home, I'm going to reread the last chapter of Royce's history, okay? Right? That relative to what John was saying. You understand? I'll reread that. Huh? And that's what I take to be the kind of conversations we should have. Yes, ma'am. Yeah. What time?
Maybe I'm overstating, but for Royce and his fugitive essays, the essay is Leaving Me, he very specifically addresses the problems of transcendentalism as morally weak, systematically vacuous, and too individualistic. And in my reading of Royce, it seems to me he really very consciously is picking up the mantle of Emerson and making it respectable in the context of the professionalization of philosophy in America. He was coming into Harvard at a very critical time. He wanted sort of the fatness, but he wanted it to be systematically responsible, morally rigorous, as well as less individualistic. And I think he was true to that mission that he identified, I think was in 1881 or 2, in one of his very early essays. I may have my dates wrong, but it's very early. It's one of the fugitive essays. Somebody could help me if they have a Roycean catalog. Well, you are. But anyway.
Ignis is in the audience.
But I mean, those were the three charges that he saw, and I really feel, in my reading of Royce, he really tried to follow that through.
Emerson was not a transcendentalist. So I said Emerson was not a transcendentalist, so we can get rid of that one right at the start. So I'm not sure I followed the rest of it. Are you saying to me that Royce tried to hold on to the Emersonian tradition? I mean, Emerson, as you know, at Harvard was an outlaw. You know that, yeah. And for really, to us, really fine reasons. When he gave the Divinity School address, he simply said to them, "Don't do it." The ordination, right? Huh? Don't do it. I mean, come on. And so we got two of our guys, Emerson and Percy, are welcome here. I'm really glad to be here, right? I mean, so now, what were you saying about? I think the two people who really get the American thing are Royce and Dewey, not James. He doesn't get the American thing. I mean, there's a whole fabric here, you see, but that it plays in some. But he doesn't get the American thing. It's Royce and Dewey who get it.
Well, I think that's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
That Royce does get.
Yes, he does get it.
The Emersonian tradition and translate it into his time when professional philosophy was entering university. And I think that the way in which he tries to pick up some of what he finds is good in the American tradition of the mind as well as Emerson is to make it more systematic.
See, but I'm tougher on this. You see, the thing, what I want to say to you is that you cannot make up through study that Royce was a Californian in a really tough-ass time. I mean, Royce knew what it was, right, to be in a really tough situation. You cannot simulate that. You see? And that Dewey also, right, had a sense of that. Right? And that not only in Burlington, he winds up with his father's grocer, quartermaster in Bivouac, and he goes to All City. I mean, did you ever look into what All City was like when Dewey was down there teaching, 15-year-olds? Chicago was a brawling, to use Sandberg's term, hog butcher, real tough-ass place. James was always fey. The whole thing was fey. Big arguments about whether the new sod should be 3 inches or 5 inches deep. Come on. That's not Royce. That's not Dewey. You see? And for Royce, a Conestoga wagon is an experienceable. It's not some, artifact. And I think that's telling, you see, as they work out this, social philosophy. Now, look, James had an utterly exquisite capacity to diagnose the comings and goings of the way in which we just sort of are. I mean, nobody can do that the way he can, as he does all through all his travels and everything he does. Absolutely, superb. But the fabric, right, the soches, the social fabric and so on, was not his mien, to rescue Emerson, you see, as a kind of hard-edged guy and so on, there's a long thing about that around the question of abolition and all kinds of stuff and so on. But in circles, in compensation, Emerson grew his own fruit trees, traveled by buckboard, made a living, talking and the line is really Edwards, Emerson, Royce, Dewey. And James is the Plato there. He's the Plato. I mean, he's the way I see it. And of course, we so mistreated Peirce that who knows what that would have been like. Yeah. This is the last question, so it should be kind. Who is it? Yeah. You going to ask the last question? You're going to stand up to do it. Yeah.
I think I better.
Yeah.
I'm not sure why Emerson rejects a holy meaning beyond and away. That is not Emerson I know. What is the transparent island? What is the import of ontologically of circles? It's an enormous beyond of Emerson. And yet Dewey is struggling with himself. Dewey is struggling with transcendence.
With what?
Transcendence.
Yeah.
When Randolph Bourne says of Dewey, says to Dewey, in my right of the archives, you never transcend anything. He was mistaken, but it was critically brilliant remark.
Yeah.
I'm not convinced that Dewey or Emerson had that relationship, and I certainly would not take James out. But why are you so sure? I mean, look at this way. How does McDermott build the theory of the ideal that's rooted in lived experience, but yet which acknowledges that Dewey does the visible, the step in the end?
Yeah. Okay. I wouldn't build a theory of the ideal. I would hope that it would emerge willy-nilly from what's going on. So I wouldn't put it that way. As far as the transparent eyeball is not a happy phrase. Let's face it. But I think what Dewey saw in Emerson, they said to Emerson, "What's a philosophy?" He said, "Greengrocer thinking." That was Emerson's answer. Somebody said, "What's a philosophy?" He said, "Greengrocer thinking." And I think that Dewey saw in Emerson a I mean, a sensibility for, Royce has this line, which I take as really one of the great lines of the whole tradition. The popular mind is deep. It knows 1,000 times more than it knows, that it's able to say what it knows, you say. Dewey believes that. Dewey believes everybody's educable. I believe that. I think Emerson believed that. I don't think James believed that. And you see, I would never use the word transcendence. I would use the word ennobling, as I used about Cornell's book, enriching, enhancing. So I'm not sure I follow everything you're saying, but I think that you've read Dewey's poetry. So we got the same kind of squashy stuff we get in Emerson's poetry there. I mean, I don't think it's the same kind of. It's sort of 19th century romantique stuff. I mean, it's right. But I mean, American version of it is awful. But that's not what's going on here. I think what's going on is what I call a social cosmology. In other words, that I'm basically a feet guy. I'm a Gerard Manley Hopkins guy. Still lives at dearest freshness, deep down things. I mean, walk with heavy feet. I'm a feet guy, not an eye guy. But still, I mean, I live in an environment in which there is, a sky. I mean, there's a stella, and there's the weather, and so on. And that's how I come to consciousness. And I think that Dewey and Emerson, in a certain New England kind of way, 19th century New England kind of way, shared that. That's what I think. Whereas I think that James was he himself refers to himself as a bigamist. I mean, he was so driven and built into his consciousness the landscapes, I mean, the culture and so on, of not only England but especially of Italy. And so I think that so there are different lines here. So I mean, James is, I think, the most important of all the thinkers at the end of the 19th century. I think he just changes the whole landscape. He's the number one guy. But if we're talking now the way we're talking and the way Wes was talking, then I think the line is Edwards, Emerson, Royce, Dewey. And that James is not in there. That's the way I would say it. Well, anyway, look, thanks so much.
Thank you.
Yeah.